Well, first Sunday back in the parish, and this is my gospel reading. I must admit, when I first looked at it, I didn't feel all that inspired. At first glance, the reading seems a bit grim, doesn't it? It talks about a time of division and conflict, even in one's own house. Do not think I have come to bring peace on the earth. I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. I think it's important to begin this morning by acknowledging that it's a very complicated reading, this one. It's actually part of a much larger conversation that Jesus shared with his followers, his disciples, about what it means to be a disciple. And I don't think we can fully understand the meaning of our reading without looking at that whole conversation. The conversation actually begins in the previous chapter, in chapter 9. In chapter 9, we see Jesus move from place to place. We see him heal the sick and the suffering, and he picked up some followers along the way. He heals a paralytic. He then calls Matthew to become a disciple. He restores the sight of 2 blind men, and he heals a mute. And we see his followers continue to grow and grow as he moves from place to place. And all of that's just chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, Jesus draws out 12 of his closest followers. He gathers them together and he hands power to them. He gives them the power to do what he did in chapter 9. He gives them power to heal the sick and restore the broken. They are entrusted with the power that they saw in Jesus. In verse 1 of chapter 10, we're told that he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out. They were also given authority to cure every sickness and every disease. That's a lot of power. So chapter 10 begins with that calling. Jesus encourages these 12 followers to do what he did. And then he talks to the disciples about their new ministry. He talks to them about what it will look like, what they will experience as they move out into the world. He tells them to step out boldly in faith, to proclaim the good news. So this is their message. This is their good news, to tell the sick and the suffering that the kingdom has come near. They're sent out, in the words of chapter 10, with no gold or silver or copper in their belts, to cure the sick, to raise the dead, to cleanse the leper, and to cast out demons. Whew. And Jesus predicts that this will be a difficult ministry for the disciples. It certainly was for him. He warns them that they will be attacked because of their beliefs. And of course, some would say that this is still the case today. We see people today attacked because of their beliefs. So this is the context, and it can help us to understand our reading. Jesus points to a time of conflict between 2 different viewpoints. And he tells the disciples that this conflict is unavoidable. he tells the disciples that their ministry will compete with economic and social structures that tolerate neglect and abuse. And again, some might well say that not much has changed. The world of the first century was a difficult place, especially for the poor and the marginalised, for the sick and the malnourished. It was a difficult place for the outsider, those living on the edges of society. And this is the heart of the matter, the heart of our reading today. This is our context. In the call of the disciples, in their commission, we see new priorities. We see new values. Through the ministry of Jesus and his followers, these 12 disciples, we see new and genuine concern for the poorest of the poor. That's what Jesus was all about, care and concern for the poorest of the poor. We see genuine care and concern for the outsider, the widow, the orphan, the refugee. So our gospel today has some pretty far-reaching political and social implications for us as the people of God living here in Bayswater. In particular, we struggle with the knowledge that we don't really hold a privileged position in our culture anymore. Our church, in many ways, is in decline. In a way, we now share common ground with the disciples of the first century. We speak from the edges of our society, not the centre anymore. Just as the disciples were called to challenge injustice and neglect, perhaps we are called to offer a similar ministry here today. So when Jesus talks about conflict within the family, son against father, daughter against mother, he's talking about a conflict that develops when two different viewpoints come together. And again, it's unavoidable. In a sense, we're being reminded today that we need to stand firm. We must maintain the faith when we see this injustice and neglect in the world around us. That's what Jesus is saying. We are called to speak the truth. We are called to defend the cause of the most vulnerable, even when it's costly. Even when what we say, what we do, isn't welcome. So our reading today reminds us that discipleship is a journey. It shapes our lives. It's not a job. It's not an occupation. It's tied to who we are as Christians. For those first disciples, for those 12 followers, as they prepared to step out into the world with all that power and all that authority, Jesus offers some very wise advice. He reminds them that they can't pick and choose who is worthy. That's what he's saying. With all that power and authority, they can't pick and choose who is worthy. So when we consider the social and political priorities that shape our world, this reading has a lot to say. The church must have a voice. We proclaim the kingdom is near to those who need to hear this message. We give consideration to the poor and the needy, the neglected, the isolated, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their religious convictions, regardless of their income or their background. We are called to stand firm, even when it will be costly. And yes, there will be divisions. It's unavoidable. We will see it in our families, we will see it in our church, and we will see it in our nation. If I can, I'd like to finish by reading the verses from Matthew's Gospel that follow on from our reading today. Jesus talks to his followers about the welcome that we offer. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. The Lord be with you. Let us now pray for the world and for the church, and thank God for God's goodness.